At my wedding, back in 1990, my late mother toasted us by quoting Agatha Christie's immortal words, "An archaeologist is the best husband any woman can have. The older she gets, the more interested he is in her." Agatha knew well of what she spoke. I presume that many of you are familiar with her and that some of you may even have read one or more of her many mystery books, but I bet that most of you don't know that she was married to the archaeologist Max Mallowan. She met him in 1930 when she came to visit the site of Ur in Mesopotamia, where he was excavating. They got married 6 months later. From then on, she came with him on most of his digs and wrote many of her books while there when she wasn't helping him process the material that they were finding. Mallowan was Sir Leonard Woolley's right-hand man at the site of Ur in what is now modern Iraq. Agatha Christie, along with most of the rest of England at that time, was entranced by the announcements of their finds from the famous death pits of Ur. She had come to see them for herself. She found herself even more entranced by Mallowan than she was by the death pits. However, it seems that after she married him, Agatha was no longer welcome at the site. And as a result, he left Ur soon thereafter to start his own excavations. Now, the scuttlebutt is that Woolley's wife, Lady Catherine Woolley, didn't want to share the attention of the men on the dig with anyone else. And that's why lovely Louise, the first person killed off in Agatha Christie's book Murder in Mesopotamia, is believed by many to be based on Lady Woolley, especially since she's described as a, quote, beautiful but difficult archaeologist's wife, end quote. Reportedly, those who were in the know instantly recognized Louise as Lady Catherine, and Louise apparently, or rather Lady Catherine didn't apparently mind at all. Now, the site of ancient Ur is situated on the Euphrates River, north of where the river emerges into the Persian Gulf. This is the region known as ancient Mesopotamia, a name that comes from the Greek words Meso and Potamia, and it means literally the area between the rivers. And that would be the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. Ur was a site famous in antiquity, with all of the typical features of a Bronze Age Mesopotamian city, including religious structures known as ziggurats that reached up to the sky. Woolley identified the site with Ur of the Chaldees, which the book of Genesis mentions in association with the patriarch Abraham. But it's still anyone's guess whether Woolley was actually right about that. Woolley and Mallowan began excavating at Ur in 1922, but it wasn't until the middle of their fifth field season, 1926 to 27, that they began digging the cemetery at the site. And thereafter, between 1927 and 29, the two archaeologists uncovered the 16 royal burials that would make them famous. All told, including the later excavations that Woolley conducted without Mallowan after 1931, there were about 1,850 intact burials that were found in the cemetery. The royal burials thus make up only a small percentage of the total graves that they excavated. Now, these royal burials at Ur date to about 2500 BC, give or take. And although many of the other burials in the cemetery were very simple, the royal tombs were quite impressive. They usually had a stone chamber that was either vaulted or domed, into which the royal body was placed. The chamber was at the bottom of a deep pit, with access only possible via a steep ramp from the surface. The precious grave goods were mostly found in the burial chamber with the body. Wheeled vehicles and oxen and attendants were found in both the chamber and in the pit outside. Now, there were numerous attendants that were found in these death pits. One had more than 70 bodies who went with their master or mistress into the afterlife. Another held more than 60 bodies, and still another had 40 bodies. Most of these were women, but there were men as well. Woolley assumed that they had drunk poison after climbing down the ramp into the pit, But CAT scans of some of the skulls that were done in 2009 at the University of Pennsylvania indicates that at least those people had been killed by having a sharp instrument driven into their head just below and behind the ear while they were still alive. Death would have been instantaneous. The grave goods that Woolley and Malawan found with the royal bodies were amazing, despite the fact that many of the graves had been looted long ago in antiquity. They found gold tiaras, gold and lapis jewelry, gold and electrum daggers, even a gold helmet, though that was probably ceremonial because gold helmets aren't very good at stopping a sword or an axe in battle. But there were also delicate sculptures, such as the pair of figures that depict a ram in a thicket. One of these lovely sculptures is now in the British Museum. The other one is housed at the Penn Museum in Philadelphia. The excavators at Ur also unearthed the remains of a wooden harp with ivory and lapis inlays, which Woolley had reconstructed. One of the royal tombs contained a wooden box with inlays on front and back, which Woolley dubbed the Standard of Ur, thinking that maybe it had been carried on top of a pole into battle and in front of the troops, much like the Romans had their banners centuries later. He suggested this because of the scenes that are depicted, which include a possible battle followed by loot being presented to the king and then a victory banquet. Among the figures in the banquet is a musician holding a harp, and it's partially that which was the basis for Woolley's reconstruction. Of course, these scenes could also be a depiction of something else entirely, and this might just be a simple wooden box rather than a standard. The discussions and the debates about this and some of the other objects still continue today, even though it's almost a century after Woolley and Malawan found the royal graves. Now, Woolley and Malawan were not the first archaeologists to find amazing things in the ancient sites of Mesopotamia. So let's go back in time to the 19th century. And let's talk about the first modern scholars and archaeologists who worked in the region. The first individual that we should mention is the British scholar Sir Henry Rawlinson. He helped to crack and then translate cuneiform script in the 1830s. Cuneiform is a wedge-shaped writing system that was used to write Akkadian and Babylonian, Hittite, Old Persian, and other languages in the ancient Near East. Rawlinson, who was a British army officer posted to what is now Iran, cracked the secret of cuneiform by translating a trilingual inscription. It was written in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. Darius the Great of Persia, in about 519 BC, carved the inscription 400 feet above the desert floor into a cliff face at a site called Behistun. The story that's often repeated is one that was originally told by Rawlinson himself. It seems that after spending as many as 12 years, from about 1835 to 1847, in copying the inscription by climbing up and down rickety ladders and scaffolding, he eventually hired what he called a wild Kurdish boy to shimmy down a rope from the top of the cliff in order to copy down the final lines of the long inscription. The boy actually had to swing from side to side and run along the cliff face in order to copy down the last couple of bits. In any event, already by 1837, a good 10 years before the copying of the entire inscription was even completed, Rawlinson figured out how to read the first two paragraphs of the part that was written in Old Persian. He presented his findings in official papers that were published in 1837 and 1839, just ahead of other scholars who had also been working on deciphering the inscription. Even then, it reportedly took him another 20 years to decipher the Babylonian and Elamite parts of the inscription and to successfully read the whole thing. Along the way, though, Rawlinson was able to take his knowledge of cuneiform and begin translating some of the inscriptions that British archaeologist Sir Austen Henry Layard was finding at his excavations in what is now Iraq. In fact, Rawlinson was able to confirm that Layard had found two ancient sites that up until that point had only been known from the Bible. And that brings us to the first archaeologists who were working in Mesopotamia. We'll get back to Layard in a moment. But let's first turn to Paul-Émile Botta, an Italian-born archaeologist who was working for the French. In December 1842, Botta began the first archaeological excavations ever conducted in what is now Iraq. In his day job, he was the French consul at Mosul, but that was a position that essentially left him free to conduct archaeological fieldwork on behalf of the Louvre in Paris. And that's what he spent most of his time doing, with the active endorsement of his higher-ups back in France. Botta's first efforts were concentrated on the mounds known as Kuunjik, which are right across the river from the city of Mosul. However, he didn't find much there, and he quickly abandoned his efforts rather prematurely, as it turned out. From one of his workmen, he learned that some sculptures had been found at a site called Horsabad, which was located about 14 miles to the north. So in March 1843, he began excavating there instead, with immediate success. Within a week, he had begun to unearth a great Assyrian palace there. At first, he had thought he had found the remains of ancient Nineveh. But now we know that Horsabad is the ancient site of Dur-Sharrukin, which was the capital city of Sargon II, the Neo-Assyrian king who ruled from 721 to 705 BC. As for Austin Henry Layard, he didn't mean to undertake excavations in Mesopotamia, at least not at first. In 1839, at the age of 22, he had been traveling with a friend to Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka, overland from England. They had gone through Turkey and had visited Jerusalem, Petra, Aleppo, and other ancient cities when they reached Mosul in May of 1840. There, the archaeology bug bit him, but it was a few years before he was able to return and actually begin to excavate. Now, Layard's initial archaeological efforts began in 1845. They were at the site of Nimrud, which he first thought was ancient Nineveh. It was located a few miles downstream from Mosul. In order to fool the local ruler, who was a one-eyed, one-eared despot named Muhammad Pasha, Layard pretended to be going on a hunting expedition, but he secretly included some excavating equipment among his supplies. When he got to the site, he spent the first night in the hut of a local sheikh, dreaming of what he might find. He described it later as visions of palaces underground, of gigantic monsters, sculptured figures, and endless inscriptions. As it turned out, that was more of a premonition than a dream, because he found all that and more in the coming years. The next morning, he began to dig. His team consisted of 6 local men, whom he split into 2 teams. They began digging in 2 different areas, far apart on the mound. Before the very first day had even ended, both groups uncovered rooms with walls covered in carved inscriptions. As it turned out, the rooms belonged to 2 different palaces. In a single day, Layard had found not 1, but 2 Assyrian palaces. Today, they're usually called the Northwest and the Southwest palaces. As a result, Layard doubled the size of his team to 11 men, and later he expanded again to a total of about 30 workmen. Now, from the inscriptions that Layard found, it eventually became clear that the Northwest Palace was built by Ashurnasirpal II, who reigned from 884 to 859 BC. Esarhaddon, who reigned 200 years later, from about 680 to 669 BC, he built the Southwest Palace. There was also a central palace at the site, which was only discovered later. That one was built by Tiglath-Pileser III, who was in power from 745 to 727. Shalmaneser III, who ruled from 858 to 824 and was the son of Ashurnasirpal II, also had buildings and monuments constructed at the site. Layard published a book about his amazing discoveries at Nimrud, including the Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser III that mentions Jehu, the king of Israel. The book appeared in 1849, and it instantly cemented his reputation as an archaeologist, as well as an intrepid adventurer and an engaging writer. He called the book Nineveh and Its Remains, since that's what he thought he was excavating. However, this turned out to be an unfortunate choice for the title when the inscriptions from the site were finally deciphered. They confirmed that the site was actually ancient Kalhu, biblical Kala, rather than Nineveh. As it turns out, Kalhu was the second capital city established by the Assyrians, the first one being Ashur itself. It served as their capital for almost 175 years, from 879 until 706 BC. After that, Sargon II moved the capital to Dur-Sharrukin for a brief period, and then Sennacherib moved it to Nineveh. Other archaeologists have excavated at Nimrud since Layard, almost up until the present day. In fact, it was in the news as recently as March 2015, when videos were released by ISIS militants showing them taking a bulldozer and a sledgehammer to the ancient remains at the site, and also destroying artifacts from Nimrud that were in the Mosul Museum. Heartbreaking images indeed. In 1849, Layard returned to Mosul for another round of excavations, but this time his primary focus was Kayunjik, the mound that Bota had abandoned 7 years earlier. And he didn't come back with empty pockets either. In fact, Layard now had enough money to hire up to 300 workmen at a time, 10 times more than he had ever had at Nimrud. Layard had better luck than Bota did. His men immediately began unearthing walls with reliefs and images. This time, translation of the tablets found there confirmed that this was the actual site of ancient Nineveh, finally. By the time he and several other excavators who followed him were done, a palace of Sennacherib, who was in power from 704 to 681 BC, had been uncovered, as well as a palace of Ashurbanipal, Sennacherib's grandson, who was in power from 668 to 627. Sennacherib, who had moved the Assyrian capital from Dur-Sharrukin after he came to the throne, built what he called a palace without rival at Nineveh. At first, Layard knew it only as the southwestern palace. However, within it, he found what is referred to now as the King's Library. These were 2 large rooms in which he found clay tablets piled a foot deep on the floor. When the translation of these tablets began, the real name of the palace became clear. Today, Sennacherib's palace is probably most famous for what is called the Lachish Room. In here, Layard found wall reliefs with both pictures and inscriptions carved into the stone slabs, showing Sennacherib's capture of the city of Lachish in 701 BC. At that time, Lachish was the second most powerful city in Judah. Sennacherib attacked it before proceeding on to besiege Jerusalem. The capture of Lachish is described in the Hebrew Bible, as is the siege of Jerusalem. Layard's discovery was one of the first times that an event from the Bible could be confirmed by what we call extra-biblical, that is, outside the Bible, sources. Almost 30 years before Layard found Sennacherib's palace, Lord Byron had immortalized the biblical account in his poem, which is called The Destruction of Sennacherib, and that was published in 1815. It reads, "The Assyrian came down like the wolf on the fold, and his cohorts were gleaming in purple and gold, and the sheen of their spears was like stars on the sea, when the blue wave rolls nightly on deep Galilee." 20th century excavations at the actual site of Lachish, in what is now Israel, not only confirmed the destruction of the city in about 701 BC, but it also revealed an Assyrian siege ramp built out of tons of earth and rocks and looking very similar to the ramps that are depicted in Sennacherib's reliefs. The Nineveh reliefs are also full of gruesome scenes, including captives having their tongues pulled out and being flayed alive, along with decapitated heads shown on a pole. Now, it's universally accepted that the Assyrians practiced what they preached, and they actually committed these atrocities. But the depiction of them in Sennacherib's palace is most likely meant as propaganda, a means to deter other kingdoms from rebelling against the Assyrians. Foreign ambassadors were probably shown the room in the heart of the palace and then allowed to take the message back home that they probably shouldn't try to rebel or cross the Assyrians in any way, shape, or form. At this point, though, I need to note that Layard was not a trained archaeologist by any stretch of the imagination, nor was Botha for that matter. Brian Fagan has said bluntly, quote, "Botha and Layard were appalling excavators by today's standards," end quote. In particular, Layard excavated by chasing walls, which we don't do in archaeology today. This means that his men dug a trench straight down into the mound until they hit a stone wall. And then they followed the wall by digging a tunnel. When that wall met another one, they turned the corner and they tunneled along that wall, and so on until they had burrowed along all four edges of the room. And Botha and his men did essentially the same thing. Now, concerning the excavation of Sennacherib's palace at Nineveh, Layard noted, "In the magnificent edifice I had opened no less than 71 halls, chambers, and passages, whose walls had almost without exception been paneled with sculptured slabs of alabaster." He estimated that his men had dug enough tunnels to expose almost 10,000 feet, or about 2 miles, worth of such walls, along with 27 doorways, which were formed by colossal winged bulls and lion sphinxes. However, this also means that Layard frequently left the middle of the rooms unexcavated. And he also wasn't particularly interested in any of the pottery that his men uncovered during the course of their excavations. What he was interested in was the inscribed slabs that made up these walls, as well as the colossal statues. Now, many of these were shipped back to the British Museum, where they can be seen on display today. Others that were found both here and at Nimrud and Horsabad wound up in museum collections around the world, including some at Dartmouth and Amherst colleges in the United States. It took a tremendous amount of effort to get the pieces back to the British Museum, or the Louvre in the case of Botha and his successor, Victor Place. Botha's finds went on display in the Louvre starting in May of 1847. He beat Layard and the British Museum by a matter of months because their pieces didn't go on display until September of that year. In order to get his finds back to France, at one point Botha had a wagon built with wheels that were 3 feet wide, only to find out that it was too heavy to be moved, even by more than 200 men. Layard had similar problems in transporting his finds back to England. However, it was Victor Place who replaced Botha at Horsabad and had the worst misfortune of all. It was on his watch, in 1853 and 1855, that 2 separate shipments of antiquities were lost in the Tigris River while being sent back to France. In 1853, bandits intercepted the shipment. When they realized that the cargo wasn't gold, they spitefully capsized and sank the boat and 4 rafts, complete with their cargo of precious and irreplaceable ancient finds. In 1855, the shipment of antiquities was too heavy, and it sank because of the weight of the artifacts. Of the more than 200 crates that were lost, nearly 120 contained artifacts from Horsabad, and another 68 had sculptures from Sennacherib's palace at Nineveh, which Place had been allowed to take for the Louvre, even though the British team had excavated them. There was also material from elsewhere in Mesopotamia, which had been retrieved by a French expedition to Babylonia. Now, Seton Lloyd, one of the greatest British archaeologists of recent times, called this one of the most appalling disasters in the history of archaeology. Only a few of the pieces were recovered right away, so I'm pretty sure that dredging the river in this location might still be very worthwhile. However, the finds kept coming. 2 years before the disaster on the Tigris, Hormuzd Rassam, Layard's protege and successor at Nineveh, had discovered Ashurbanipal's palace at the site, literally under the nose of Victor Plas, who was also digging there. Rassam and his team dug secretly for 3 straight nights in disputed territory on the mound, and when their trenches first revealed the walls and the sculptures of the palace, Plas could do nothing but congratulate them on their finds. Within the palace, it was Rassam's turn to find a tremendous library of cuneiform text, just like Layard had done previously in Sennacherib's palace. In fact, it's generally considered that the state archives were split between the 2 palaces, even though they were 2 generations apart. The 2 sets of tablets together number about 25,000 in all. They're now at the British Museum. The texts that were found by Rassam in Ashurbanipal's palace came from what is often called the Royal Library. Apart from the state documents, they include religious, scientific, and literary texts, which Ashurbanipal had instructed his scribes to collect or to copy from all over the empire. They form one of the great libraries of the ancient world, perhaps to be mentioned in the same breath with the much later libraries at Pergamon and Alexandria. Included among the tablets were copies of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Babylonian flood story. In fact, speaking of these, I should mention here the story of George Smith, which is one of my favorite examples of the excellence of accidental archaeology. It was in 1872, nearly 20 years after Rassam first found the tablets, that a man named George Smith was employed as a banknote engraver in London. He also moonlighted at the British Museum, sorting out the numerous tablets that Rassam had sent back from Nineveh. As I tell my students, by day, Smith was a banknote engraver. By night, he was an Assyriologist. He wasn't quite Batman or Superman, and he wasn't just an Assyriologist at night, but the students get the picture. Now, at one point, Smith began reading a large fragmentary tablet as he was piecing it together. He was rather astonished to realize that he was reading an account of a great flood, very similar to the deluge account found in the Hebrew Bible. You know, the one that Noah had survived? Only in the account that Smith was reading, which turned out to be the 11th tablet from the Epic of Gilgamesh, the survivor was not Noah, but a man named Utnapishtim. When he announced his discovery at a meeting of the Society of Biblical Archaeology in December of 1872, all of London was abuzz with excitement. The problem, though, was that a big piece was missing from the middle of the tablet, right at the part where everything gets interesting. So the Daily Telegraph, one of the newspapers of the day, promised 1,000 British pounds to anyone who would go and look for the missing fragment. Smith decided to go himself and take him up on their offer, even though he had never been to Mesopotamia and he had no training as an archaeologist. Nevertheless, within a week after he arrived at Nineveh, he found the missing piece. How on earth could he have done that? It turns out it was very simple, actually. He reasoned that perhaps the workmen who had found the other fragments had missed this big one. So rather than digging into the mound again, he searched through the back dirt pile, as it's called by archaeologists. That is the huge artificial mound that had been created by the archaeologists and their workmen when they dumped out the earth that they had excavated at the site. The dirt in these piles should be empty of ancient artifacts, but the pile at Nineveh was full of them because the workmen dug so fast and were frequently careless in picking out the pieces that they came across, whether they were pottery or clay tablets. So not only did Smith find the missing piece that he had come for, but he found something like 300 other pieces from clay tablets that the workers had also missed and thrown out. And when he got back to London, the missing piece fit perfectly into his flood tablet. Interestingly, something rather similar just happened again in 2014, when another Assyriologist at the British Museum, Irving Finkel, announced that he had found a copy of the Akkadian version of the flood story. In this version, the survivor is a man named Atrahasis. What's interesting about Finkel's tablet is that it appears to describe the ark as being round in shape, as opposed to the way that we usually think of it. The tablet is in a private collection. The owner first brought it to Finkel in 1985, but he wouldn't leave it with him long enough for him to translate it. It was only in 2009 that Finkel was able to gain access to it again and to actually translate it. Now, the 19th century excavations at Nimrud, Nineveh, Khorsabad, and then at Ur, Babylon, and other sites began an era of excavation in the region that continues to this day. Max Malawan and Agatha Christie reopened the excavations at Nineveh starting in 1931 after they parted ways with Woolley. In addition to other sites, they also dug at Nimrud beginning in 1949. As recently as 1988, spectacular discoveries were also made at Nimrud by local Iraqi archaeologists. They uncovered the graves of several Assyrian princesses from the time of Ashurnashirpal II in the 9th century BC. These included incredible gold necklaces and earrings and other treasures. They nearly disappeared during the Second Gulf War, but turned out to be safely hidden in a bank vault. With the assistance of National Geographic, they have since been recovered. And I'm happy to say that foreign excavations are now being resumed in Iraq after having been suspended since about 1990 because of the ongoing wars and chaos in the region. So we have a lot to look forward to. It'll be interesting to see what the next century of expeditions will uncover in the region.